The wind moved slowly across the plains that evening, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and fading summer corn. The sun was sinking behind the hills, bleeding orange and gold over the horizon, turning every shadow long and uncertain. A lone rider approached from the west, his horse's hooves thudding softly on the cracked earth. He wore his hair tied back with a strip of leather. His dark eyes carried the stillness of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. He hadn't been back in 5 years. 5 long years since he had left this valley, left her, left everything that once tethered his heart to this world. The mountains hadn't changed. The river still ran the same crooked line across the land, glinting like a knife in the dying light. But something inside him had shifted, weathered by time, regret, and silence. The Apache rode slowly through the tall grass, the rhythm of his horse steady but heavy with memory. Every step forward felt like stepping into a place half buried in the past. He remembered the small house near the fields, the sound of her laughter in the mornings, and how it used to calm the restless spirit that often pulled him toward the open desert. But that laughter had faded long ago. Swallowed by years of absence and unspoken hurt, he stopped his horse at the edge of the cornfield. The air was still, save for the rustle of stalks swaying gently in the breeze. In the distance, he saw smoke rising from a chimney, thin, gray, and fragile against the twilight sky. She still lived there then. The sight made his heart tighten, though his face remained calm. Carved from stone and quiet endurance, he dismounted and walked slowly toward the small house. The ground beneath his boots felt strange, too soft for a man used to riding and sleeping on hard desert rock. The fields were golden and heavy with harvest, and the faint hum of crickets filled the air. It all seemed so peaceful, yet his chest carried a storm. When he reached the fence, he stopped. His hand rested on the worn wood rail, his fingers tracing the splinters as if reading the memory of what once was. There was a time when he had built that fence with his own hands, laughing as she teased him for not making it straight. He hadn't thought of those days in years, yet now every moment returned, bright, alive, and painful. Then he saw her. She was standing by the porch, a basket of corn in her arms. Her hair was tied back, the same dark brown it had always been, and her dress was plain but clean, marked by the kind of life that had to keep going no matter who left. She looked smaller than he remembered, but stronger somehow, like the land itself. Worn by the wind, yet unbroken, she froze when she saw him. The basket slipped slightly in her grip, and a few ears of corn tumbled to the ground. For a long moment neither spoke. The only sound between them was the whisper of the wind moving through the field. He took a slow breath. "Evening," he said, his voice deep and rough from years of dust and silence. She didn't answer at first. Her eyes moved over him, searching, cautious. He looked older, leaner, harder. The kind of man the desert shapes when it takes everything soft from him. Finally, she said, "You shouldn't have come." "I had to," he replied. She turned slightly, setting down the basket. 5 years is a long time to remember you had to. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I know." The air between them thickened with everything they didn't say. The past hung heavy old wounds, broken promises, and the quiet understanding that love alone had not been enough. After a while, she spoke again, softer now. "You look the same, almost, but your eyes." She paused, then looked away. "They're tired." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe they finally learned what they were looking for. She frowned. "And what was that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his boots crunching softly over the dry ground. She stiffened, her hands tightening around the edge of her dress. He could see the pulse at her throat, quick and uncertain. "I didn't come to stir up old pain," he said quietly. "I just needed to see you. One last time." The words hung between them, trembling with meaning neither dared to unfold. The light was fading fast, and the shadows of the corn grew long across the yard. She studied him for a long moment, then finally said, "If you came for peace, you won't find it here." "Not anymore," he nodded, his jaw tightening. "Maybe not, but I had to try." A small sound broke the stillness, the cry of a child from inside the house. It was faint but sharp enough to make both of them freeze. Her eyes widened slightly, and she turned toward the door. He stood motionless, his face unreadable, though something in his chest shifted painfully. "You have a child," he said, his voice low. She hesitated, her back to him. "Yes." He didn't ask the next question, though it burned in his throat. He just looked toward the small window of the house where a dim lantern flickered. "I should go," he murmured after a long silence. She turned back to face him, her eyes glistening in the last light of dusk. "You came all this way just to leave again?" He gave a small nod. "I had to see for myself that you were all right." Her breath caught. "And what did you see?" He looked at her for a long moment, the years between them written in the quiet ache of his eyes. "I saw that the world went on without me." Something flickered across her face. Sorrow, anger, maybe forgiveness. She stepped closer, close enough for him to see the small lines near her eyes, the ones time had drawn while he was gone. For a moment, she looked as if she might say something more, but instead, she just reached down, picked up one of the fallen ears of corn, and handed it to him. It was a simple gesture, one so small it should have meant nothing, but the warmth of her hand brushed against his, and suddenly the years fell away. The ache, the distance, the silence, all of it collapsed into that one touch. He felt his throat tighten, his voice barely steady when he said, "You still keep the fields." Her eyes lifted to his. "The land doesn't stop growing because someone leaves." He nodded, unable to look away. In that instant, something changed, not fully spoken. Not fully understood, but real enough to stir everything he thought he had buried. A breeze passed between them, carrying the scent of dry earth and harvest. She took a step back, her expression unreadable now. "You should go before it gets dark," she said softly. He stood still, holding the corn in his hand. The sky above them had turned deep red. The color of endings and things unspoken. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the years that had broken them. But the words wouldn't come. So he just nodded once, turned toward his horse, and started to walk away. Behind him, he heard the faint creak of the porch in her voice, quiet but trembling as she said, "It was never the land that needed tending. It was us." He stopped, his heart pounding in the quiet dusk. He didn't turn around. Not yet. The wind carried her words away, scattering them through the fields, where they would settle like seeds waiting for something to grow again. And as the last light faded from the sky, the Apache stood motionless, holding that single ear of corn in his rough hand. Knowing that one simple gesture had just changed everything, the night air had grown cooler by the time he reached the edge of the field again. The horse snorted softly, sensing his hesitation, as if it too knew that walking away wasn't going to be easy this time. He stood there, the corn still in his hand, feeling its rough texture beneath his calloused fingers. The house behind him glowed faintly under the lantern light, small and steady against the darkness, like a piece of his past refusing to die. He looked toward the mountains, the same ones that had watched him ride away 5 years ago. Back then, he believed leaving was the right thing to do. The war between settlers and his people had grown worse, and there had been whispers, threats, fear in every direction. He thought that by leaving, he was protecting her from the bloodshed that followed him. But the truth was simpler and sharper. He had been afraid. Afraid of what love demanded, afraid of what he was becoming, and afraid that the world would never let them be. He had spent those 5 years wandering. The lands of the Apache stretched far, but so did loneliness. He worked where he could, traded when he had to, and kept his distance from both soldiers and tribes. He carried with him the weight of a man caught between two worlds, neither fully belonging to one nor forgiven by the other. Yet through every mile and every season, the memory of her stayed, the sound of her voice, the way her eyes softened when she spoke his name. He had promised himself he would never return. But time has a way of testing promises, especially those built on pain. A few weeks ago, he had heard from a passing traveler that the valley had changed, that settlers had moved closer. There had been trouble near the river. That news had stirred something restless inside him, something he couldn't quiet. Maybe it was guilt, maybe duty, maybe love still buried somewhere deep. So he came back, unsure of what he would find, but knowing he couldn't stay away any longer. Now, standing under the wide sky, he felt the years pressing down on him. The stars were sharp and cold, scattered across the heavens like pieces of forgotten dreams. He tied his horse to a nearby post and walked a little farther down the path to where the old well stood. The wooden bucket was cracked and gray with age, the rope frayed but still strong. He lowered it slowly, listening to the hollow sound echo down into the dark. When he lifted it back, the water shimmered faintly in the moonlight. He drank deeply, the coolness steadying his thoughts. He could still see the house from where he stood, a faint silhouette against the field. The image stirred memories of nights long ago, sitting by the fire with her, sharing stories, listening to the soft crackle of wood. Back then, he had believed they could build something lasting, something untouched by the world's bitterness. But dreams had a way of breaking when the world pressed too hard. Inside the house, she couldn't sleep. The child had gone quiet. Again, the soft rhythm of breathing the only sound in the room. She sat by the window, watching the faint outline of his figure near the well. Her chest ached with a mix of longing and resentment. 5 years, she thought. 5 years of raising a child alone, keeping a small piece of land alive while trying to forget the man who once swore to stand beside her. Yet seeing him again had shaken everything she had built to protect herself. The way he had looked at her, not like a stranger, but like a man seeing something sacred he'd lost, unsettled her heart. She told herself she was angry, that she had every reason to be. But beneath the anger was a truth she couldn't deny. Part of her had waited. Even when she said she hadn't, she glanced toward the small bed where the child lay sleeping. A soft smile touched her lips before she looked back out the window. The wind brushed against the glass, carrying the faint sound of a horse shifting in the distance. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the curtain. She wondered if he would leave before morning, or if fate would make him stay just a little longer. The Apache turned at the sound of a door creaking. She had stepped outside, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The moonlight fell across her face, gentle and silver, softening the edges of her expression. For a moment, they only looked at each other, the silence speaking more than words could. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I tried," she replied. "It didn't work." He nodded slightly. "The nights are long here." "They always were," she said, her voice calm but edged with something deeper. "You'd know that if you'd stayed." He met her eyes, then looked down. "I thought leaving would make things easier." "For who?" she asked. He didn't answer. The wind carried her words away, but the weight of them stayed between them, heavy as the night itself. She walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "You came back because of the trouble, didn't you?" He looked up sharply. "You heard too." She nodded. "Men with guns passed through here a month ago. They said they were looking for land. The kind that already belongs to others." He clenched his jaw. "The valley isn't safe anymore. Hasn't been safe for a long time," she said. "Not since the world started changing faster than people could keep up." They stood in silence, listening to the soft hum of crickets and the far-off howl of a coyote. The land stretched wide around them, beautiful and unforgiving. It had given them both life and loss. Finally she said, "You don't have to stay. You did what you thought you had to. The past is gone." He shook his head slowly. "The past doesn't disappear. It just waits." Her eyes softened. "And what are you waiting for?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the house, to the faint light flickering in the window. "Maybe I'm waiting to make things right," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes there's no making it right. Sometimes there's just living with what's left." He nodded, though something in his eyes suggested he didn't believe that. "Then I'll live with it," he said. A gust of wind swept through the field, rustling the corn and lifting strands of her hair. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, there was a faint sadness there, but also something else, something that looked almost like hope. "I never thought you'd come back," she said softly. "Neither did I." He took a small step forward, close enough now that he could see the faint tremor in her hands. For a moment he wanted to reach for her, to close the distance that 5 years had carved. But he didn't. The past was still between them, wide and deep as a canyon. Instead, he said, if there's danger here, I'll stay for a while, just until it's safe. She hesitated, torn between fear and something she couldn't name. You don't owe me anything. He looked at her, his voice steady. Maybe not, but I owe this land and what it once gave me. She held his gaze, the moonlight reflecting in her eyes. You always did believe the land could forgive. Maybe it can, he said. Maybe we can too. Her breath caught, but before she could answer, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the quiet. Both turned sharply toward the hills. The rhythm was faint, but steady. Someone was riding hard through the night. She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. They're coming again. He reached for the knife at his belt, his face calm but alert. Go inside. Keep the child close. She hesitated, wanting to say more, but something in his tone left no room for argument. She turned and hurried back toward the house, glancing once over her shoulder. He stood there in the moonlight, tall and still, the wind tugging at his hair, the land itself seeming to hold its breath. As the sound of riders drew nearer, he rested his hand on the worn hilt of his blade. The years of wandering, of regret and silence, all led back to this valley. To her, to the life he once tried to leave behind. The night was no longer still. The past had come riding back through the dark, and he knew that whatever peace he had hoped to find was still far away. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like running. He felt ready, and somewhere behind the closed door, she stood with her hand pressed against her heart, knowing that everything was about to change again, just not in the way either of them expected. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the distant hills and cutting through the calm of the night. The Apache stood still, his body tense but his mind clear. The years had taught him patience. It's a kind that came from surviving in harsh places where a heartbeat could decide life or death. The moonlight spilled across the fields, turning the corn into a sea of gold and shadow. He could see the faint glow of lanterns moving closer, riders carrying torches, their light flickering like restless fireflies in the dark. Inside the small house, she held the child close, her breath shallow and her heart pounding. Through the window, she could just make out his silhouette standing alone near the fence, steady and unshaken. It was a sight both comforting and frightening. He had always carried danger in his shadow, and even now, years later, that truth hadn't changed. The riders came into view for men, all strangers, their faces half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and the glare of their torches. They slowed their horses as they reached the edge of the property, their eyes sweeping over the field and the house. The leader, a tall man with a dark coat and a rifle slung across his saddle, called out. This land belongs to the new owners, he said. No one told you to plant here. The Apache didn't move. His voice, when it came, was quiet but strong. This land isn't for sale, the man laughed. Everything's for sale now. You just haven't learned how to sell it yet. Another rider spat on the ground. You one of them desert folks who don't know how things work anymore. The Apache's hand rested lightly near his belt, but he didn't draw his knife. I know enough to stand my ground. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, studying him. Brave words for a man standing alone. Before he could answer, the door behind him creaked open. She stepped out, her shawl pulled tight, her face pale under the firelight. Leave us be, she said, her voice trembling but clear. This is our home. The leader's gaze shifted toward her. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. Yours, last I heard? This land had been left to dry. It didn't dry, she said. I kept it alive. The man laughed again, turning back to his companions. Looks like we got a stubborn one. The Apache took a slow step forward. You've said enough. Turn your horses and ride. The laughter faded. The leader's eyes narrowed. Or what? The Apache didn't answer, but the silence itself carried the threat. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the leader leaned back in his saddle, his tone shifting from mockery to something colder. Fine, he said. We'll be back when the sun rises, and when we do, we expect this land to be empty. With that, he pulled on the reins and the horses turned, the sound of their hooves fading slowly into the night. The only thing left behind was the faint smell of smoke and the quiet tension that lingered in the air. She stepped closer to him, her voice breaking slightly. They'll come back. He nodded. I know. You can't fight them all, she said. I don't need to fight them all. Just the one who leads. She looked at him, frustration and fear mixing in her eyes. That's what you said before you left. You can't solve everything with a blade. He turned to face her, his voice low. I'm not solving anything. I'm protecting what's left. The child cried softly from inside, and she went to quiet him, leaving the Apache alone again with the wind in his thoughts. As the hours passed, the night deepened. He built a small fire near the well, its light flickering softly against his face. He could still feel the weight of her words pressing on him. She was right. He had tried to fight everything once, and it had cost him everything he loved. But this time felt different. This time, the fight had come to them. He remembered when they first settled in this valley. The soil had been rough, but she had believed it could grow anything with enough care. She was the one who had taught him that not every battle was fought with weapons. Sometimes it was fought with patience, with tending, with faith. But now, as the world shifted and men with greed in their hearts came claiming land that wasn't theirs, patience seemed like a luxury. In the distance, an owl called. He looked toward the mountains, his thoughts heavy. He had heard rumors during his travels, whispers of a new railroad coming through these parts. Backed by men who bought land by force when they couldn't buy it with money. If that was true, this valley was no longer safe for anyone who called it home. When dawn finally broke, the sky turned pale gold, and the fields shimmered in the early light. He hadn't slept. The house door opened softly, and she stepped out, her expression weary. They didn't come, she said. Not yet, he replied. She looked at him, her eyes full of questions she didn't ask. Why did you really come back? He hesitated, then said, Because I couldn't keep pretending I'd forgotten what I left behind. Her gaze softened slightly. You always did carry too much guilt. Maybe, he said, but guilt is all that kept me alive. They stood quietly for a while, watching the sun rise over the fields. The land looked peaceful again, but both knew it wouldn't last. The tension that had begun the night before hadn't vanished. It was just waiting for the next storm. Later that morning, an old neighbor came walking down the dirt path. He was a quiet man, stooped from years of work, his clothes dusty and torn. He nodded to them as he approached. Heard riders pass through here last night, the old man said. You should be careful. Those men work for a company buying up land near the river. Folks who don't sell end up missing. The Apache's jaw tightened. They won't scare us off. The old man looked uneasy. I admire your courage, son, but courage doesn't mean much when greed has bullets. He left soon after, leaving them both to the heavy silence that followed. Inside, the child sat near the window, drawing lines in the dirt with a small stick. The Apache watched him for a moment. The boy's eyes were dark and curious, and for reasons he couldn't explain. Something in them felt familiar. She noticed his gaze and said quietly, He's strong. He'll have to be. He nodded, his thoughts turning inward. You raised him well. She didn't answer. But in that silence was the truth. She had done it without him, through storms and hunger and nights too long to count. The realization struck him harder than any wound he'd ever taken. As the day passed, they worked the field together the way they used to. The rhythm of it almost felt normal, almost enough to forget the danger waiting just beyond the horizon. But by evening, when the sun began to sink again, both knew the peace wouldn't hold. The Apache stood by the well once more, scanning the hills. He caught sight of movement, the glint of metal far off in the fading light. The riders had returned just as promised. He turned to her. Get the child inside. She hesitated. What will you do? He didn't answer. He only walked toward the fence, his hand resting again near his knife. The riders approached slower this time, their horses kicking up dust. The leader dismounted, his boots striking the ground with deliberate steps. I told you to leave, the man said, and I told you no, the Apache replied. The man's smile was thin. You really want to die over this patch of dirt? This land feeds those who respect it, he said. You wouldn't understand. The leader stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think this is about land? There's gold under this valley. Not much, but enough to make men like me rich. You're standing in the way of progress. The Apache's eyes darkened. Progress built on theft isn't worth the soil it stands on. The man's smile faded. You'll learn soon enough. He turned to his men, motioning toward the house. If they won't leave, make them. Before the Apache could move, the sound of gunfire split the air, not from him, but from the porch. She stood there with an old rifle, smoke rising from the barrel. The bullet struck the dirt near the rider's feet, close enough to send them scrambling for cover. Next one won't miss, she called out. Her voice steady now. The leader stared at her, fury in his eyes. You'll regret that. He swung back onto his horse and shouted to his men. They galloped off toward the ridge, their threats fading with distance. When silence returned, she lowered the rifle, her hands trembling. The Apache walked toward her, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't have done that, he said quietly. They were going to hurt us, she said. I wasn't going to let them. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. You've changed, so have you, she said. The sun dipped behind the hills, leaving the valley bathed in red light. The danger wasn't gone, it had only retreated, and both of them knew it would return, stronger than before. The Apache glanced toward the horizon, his voice low. This isn't over. She followed his gaze, her hand brushing the doorframe. It never is. And as the wind swept through the field, carrying the scent of dust and smoke, both understood that the fight for the land, and for the past that tied them to it, had only just begun. The wind howled through the valley that night, stirring the dry grass and rattling the wooden fence like a warning. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, swallowing the moon and leaving the land in a dim gray hush. The Apache sat near the fire outside, sharpening his blade with slow, measured strokes. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The creak of the barn door, the restless shifting of his horse, the faint whistle of the wind moving through the corn. Something in the air had changed, like the land itself was holding its breath. She stepped out of the house, a shawl draped around her shoulders. Her face was pale from worry, and her hands trembled just enough to betray what she felt inside. You haven't slept, she said quietly. He looked up, his dark eyes glinting faintly in the firelight. Neither have you. She came closer, her voice softer now. They'll come back. You know they will. He nodded slowly, his tone calm but cold. That's what I'm counting on. She stared at him, frustration tightening her voice. You can't fight a whole group of men. They'll bring more next time. He set the blade down and rose to his feet. Then I'll make sure they don't leave a reason to. Her chest tightened. You're talking like the man I used to know, the one who couldn't see anything past his pride. He met her gaze, the firelight flickering across his face. This isn't about pride. It's about protecting what's still ours. She turned away, gripping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. You left once to protect me. You don't get to come back and decide what's yours. Her words cut deep, but he didn't argue. The silence between them stretched, thick with everything left unsaid. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. When I left, I thought the world would stop breaking things apart. But it didn't. It just found new ways to do it. She looked at him, her expression softening for a heartbeat. You can't fix the world. No, he said, but I can stand in its way a little longer. Before she could answer, a faint light flickered far off near the hills, a torch moving in the dark, then another, and another. Her breath caught as the faint glow grew brighter. They're coming, she whispered. The Apache turned toward the barn and reached for his rifle. Take the boy to the cellar. Don't come out until it's quiet. She hesitated, panic flashing in her eyes. What if it's never quiet again? He paused, his hand on the door. Then remember that I tried. Her voice broke. You don't have to do this alone. He glanced at her, a faint sad smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I already am. The sound of horses carried across the night, heavy and sharp. The riders moved fast, their torches swinging, their voices rising above the wind. The ground trembled slightly under the pounding hooves. The Apache stepped into the open, the fire behind him casting his shadow long and fierce across the dirt. The riders slowed when they reached the edge of the field. There were more this time, at least 10 of them. The leader dismounted first, his face half-lit by the torch he carried. He looked around the land like a man inspecting something already his. "I told you we'd be back," said, his voice dripping with confidence. The Apache stood silent. His calmness seemed to unnerve the men more than any threat could. The leader stepped closer. "You had your chance to walk away. Now you'll watch this place burn, and we'll all burn with it," the Apache said, steady as stone. The man smirked, signaling to 2 of his men. They began moving toward the barn, carrying small barrels of oil. The smell hit the air almost instantly, sharp, dangerous. Final dot from inside the house. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She held the child close, her heart thundering in her chest. Every instinct told her to stay hidden, but the sound of oil splashing on wood made her body shake with helpless anger. Outside, the Apache's voice cut through the dark. "If you set fire to this land, you'll never make it to the hills alive." The leader laughed. "Big words for a man who's outnumbered." The Apache raised his rifle. "You're not the first man to think that." The air went still. Then, with a sudden snap, the leader drew his pistol. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Then gunfire broke the silence, loud and violent. The horses reared, torches dropped, and chaos exploded across the field. The Apache dove behind the fence post, firing once, twice, each shot clean and deliberate. One of the riders fell, the others scattering for cover. The firelight twisted and flickered as bullets whistled through the air. The leader shouted orders, his voice barely cutting through the noise. Inside the house, she clutched the boy tighter, praying the gunfire would stop. But it didn't. It only grew louder, closer. A bullet shattered the window, sending glass flying across the floor. The boy cried out, and she covered him, whispering his name over and over to calm him. Outside, smoke began to rise from the barn. Flames licked up the dry wood, spreading fast. The Apache saw it and cursed under his breath. He ran toward the building, firing at the men who had started the blaze. A shot grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve, but he didn't stop. He tackled one of the men to the ground, the rifle falling from his grip as they rolled in the dirt. The man reached for his knife, but the Apache was faster, striking hard. Ending it quickly, he looked up, chest heaving, the fire reflecting in his eyes. The heat grew intense, the smell of burning hay thick in the air. The horses trapped inside screamed, the sound tearing through the night like a cry from another world. "Get away from there!" She shouted from the doorway, her voice desperate. He turned to her, covered in ash and blood, but alive. "Go back inside. I can't just stand here," she cried. Another shot rang out, hitting the ground near her feet. The Apache spun, firing back before she could move. The man on the ridge dropped his rifle, falling from his horse. "Stay down." He yelled. The fire roared higher, sending sparks into the wind. The sky glowed orange now, the smoke curling upward in thick, choking waves. The leader called for his men to pull back, but some refused, shouting curses and firing wildly. The Apache moved through the haze, his movements sure, precise. A man who knew how to fight with nothing left to lose. He found the leader near the fence, reloading his pistol. Their eyes met across the smoke. For a moment, everything around them blurred. The fire, the screams, the chaos, until there was only the 2 of them. Bound by something older than anger? "You could have walked away," the leader said. Raising his weapon? "So could you," the Apache replied. They fired at the same time. Both shots cracked like thunder. The leader fell back, clutching his side, his torch tumbling into the dirt. The Apache staggered, his breath catching as pain seared through his shoulder. But he didn't fall. He stood there, swaying slightly, watching as the man struggled to rise again, hate burning in his eyes. Then, through the firelight, came the faint sound of the boy crying out. The Apache turned sharply, realizing the flames had spread toward the house. The wind had shifted, driving the smoke straight across the yard. The dry grass around the porch had caught fire, curling and hissing. She was already trying to beat the flames down with a wet cloth, her hair wild, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she shouted. He ran toward her, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Together, they fought the fire, kicking dirt, throwing water from the barrel near the well. The heat was unbearable, their lungs burning from the smoke. The boy screamed from inside the house, and for a moment the Apache froze. "I'll get him," he said, running through the doorway. The house was thick with smoke, the heat pressing in from every wall. He could barely see, but he heard the small voice calling his name. He followed it, coughing until he reached the corner where the child hid beneath a table. He scooped him up, covering the boy's face with his shirt, and carried him toward the door. Outside, she was waiting, her arms trembling as she reached for the child. The Apache handed him over, gasping for air, his body shaking from exhaustion. The flames had nearly reached the porch now. The barn was gone, the field burning in patches like broken stars scattered across the earth. In the distance, the last of the riders fled, their torches disappearing into the dark hills. The leader was gone too, lost to the fire or the shadows, neither of them could tell. The Apache sank to one knee, gripping his shoulder. She knelt beside him, her voice shaking. "You're hurt." He looked up at her, his face streaked with ash. "It's nothing." "You saved him," she said softly, looking at the boy. He didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to break. The valley was quiet again, except for the crackle of dying flames. But beneath that silence, something deeper stirred, a truth neither of them was ready to face. The danger wasn't gone. The men would return, stronger, angrier, and this time, they might not stop until everything was gone. Yet in that moment, with the world still burning around them, he looked at her and knew that walking away again would no longer be an option. The fight had come home, and the final reckoning was just beginning. The morning after the fire was eerily quiet. Smoke still drifted in lazy curls above the blackened field, and the scent of ash hung thick in the air. The one silo grass lay flattened and charred, and the barn was nothing more than a smoldering frame of broken wood and iron. The Apache stood near the well, his arm bandaged with torn cloth, his face pale from pain and exhaustion. His eyes scanned the horizon, not for danger now, but for what was left worth saving. She came out of the house holding a bucket of water, her dress streaked with soot. The boy followed behind her, clutching a small wooden horse, half-burned at the edges. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Three people tied together by fire, loss, and something still unspoken. "You should rest," she said softly. He shook his head. "There's too much to fix." "You can't rebuild everything in a day," she replied. "And you can't fight every storm that comes." He looked away, staring at the land stretching out before them. "If I don't, then what was last night for?" She set the bucket down beside him. "It was for living through it." The words sank into the silence between them, gentle but heavy. He turned toward her, his jaw tight, his voice low. "They'll come back." "Maybe," she said. "But we'll be ready next time." Her words carried a strength he hadn't heard in her voice before. There was no fear now, just quiet determination. He realized she had changed in those 5 years as much as he had, maybe more. She had learned how to survive without him, how to stand on her own, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal locket, tarnished with age. He turned it over once before handing it to her. "I found this by the river where you used to sit." She opened it slowly. Inside was a faded picture of the two of them, taken long before everything went wrong. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at it. "You kept it all this time?" He nodded. "Some things don't burn easy." She closed the locket and pressed it against her chest. "Neither do some people." For a while they worked in silence. He helped mend the fence, while she cleaned what remained of the barn. The boy carried water back and forth from the well, his small steps steady and careful. Life crept slowly back into the land, not the way it was before, but enough to remind them it still could be. By noon, the sun was high and warm, and the sky had cleared. The valley looked tired but alive. A few horses had wandered back from the hills, and birds began to circle again, cautious but curious. The Apache sat on the porch steps, watching the boy chase a chicken across the yard. She came to sit beside him, her hands resting in her lap. "He doesn't remember you," she said quietly. He only knows what I told him. He watched the child run and laughed softly, the sound low and warm. Then tell him I wasn't worth remembering. Shh. She looked at him sharply. Don't say that, he smiled faintly. It's true. I left when I should have stayed. Her eyes softened. You left because you thought it was the only way to keep us safe. And it didn't work, he said, his voice distant. She sighed, glancing out at the horizon. Maybe it did. Maybe what you did bought us enough time to become strong on our own. He thought about that for a while. The years he'd spent wandering, carrying the weight of choices that had no right answer. The people he'd lost. The peace he never found. And now, sitting there with her again, felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of belonging. The boy, he said finally, he deserves better than this. He deserves a life where men don't ride in at night with fire and hate in their hearts. She looked at him. Then help me build that for him. The simple offer hit him harder than any bullet. She wasn't asking him to stay out of pity or loneliness. She was asking him because she still believed in something good inside him. Because even after all the years, all the distance, she still saw the man he could have been. He nodded slowly. I'll stay. For as long as it takes. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled. Then we start tomorrow. That night, the three of them slept in what was left of the house. The wind outside was soft, carrying the smell of rain from the far mountains. The boy slept peacefully, his small hand curled around his mother's arm. The Apache lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the night. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to leave, no restlessness pulling him toward the road. In the morning, rain came gentle and steady. It washed the ash from the earth, leaving the scent of fresh soil in its wake. The flames that had destroyed so much had also made way for something new. The land would heal, just as they would. A week passed, then another. The men never came back. Word had spread about what happened in the valley, about how one Apache had stood alone against a band of armed riders and lived to tell it. Some called him reckless. Others called him a ghost. But those who knew better called him something else, a man, who had finally found something worth protecting. He began to rebuild the barn, piece by piece. The boy followed him everywhere, asking questions, handing him nails, trying to do what little he could. The Apache showed him how to tie rope, how to fix a broken latch, how to listen for changes in the wind. The boy listened to every word, his eyes full of curiosity. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the boy sat beside him on the fence. "Mama says you used to ride far away," he said. The Apache nodded. "I did. Why'd you stop?" the boy asked. He looked toward the horizon, the fading light painting the land in gold and red. "Because I finally found the place I was riding toward." The boy smiled and looked down at the dirt, swinging his legs. "Is it here?" "Yes," he said softly. "It's right here." It's from the porch. She watched them, her heart full and heavy all at once. The years of anger and loss hadn't vanished, but they had changed shape, turned into something gentler, something like peace. That night, when the sky filled with stars, she joined him outside again. They sat by the fire, the flames dancing between them. She handed him a small tin cup of coffee, and he took it with a quiet thank you. "You're different," she said after a while. "So are you." She smiled. "Maybe we both had to break a little to understand what really matters." He looked at her, his expression soft. "Maybe that's what it takes to start over." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the crackling fire filling the air. The land around them was scarred but beautiful, full of stories written in smoke and dust. The wind carried the scent of pine and rain, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a warning, it felt like a promise. He glanced toward the house where the boy slept, safe and dreaming. "He'll grow up strong," he said quietly. "He'll learn to take care of this place," she nodded. "And maybe one day he'll understand what it costs to keep it." The Apache smiled faintly. "Let's hope he never has to pay the same price." As the fire burned lower, he felt the weight of the past slowly lift from his shoulders. He would always carry the memories, the battles, the mistakes, the roads he shouldn't have taken, but they no longer defined him. What mattered now was here, the woman who had once been his wife, the child who might yet call him father, and the land that had tested them all and still stood beneath their feet. When dawn came, the world was quiet again. The first light stretched across the valley, touching the fields with gold. The Apache stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool morning air. The smoke was gone, the sky clear. For the first time in years, he felt the peace of a man who had finally come home. And as the sun rose higher, he whispered a simple truth to himself, one born of fire. Loss and love renewed, that sometimes what is lost isn't gone forever. Sometimes it waits for you to find your way back.